In the spring of 1944, two French farmers in Normandy stumbled upon something that defied all logic. Four American soldiers were lifting what appeared to be a 40-ton Sherman tank into the air, and they weren't even breaking a sweat. One of the GIs, noticing the bewildered expressions on the farmers' faces, called out with a grin, "The Americans are very strong." Those farmers had no idea they'd just witnessed one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. What they'd seen wasn't a real tank at all. It was an inflatable rubber dummy, lighter than a man. And those soldiers? They were members of the Ghost Army, perhaps the strangest and most creative military unit ever assembled. This is the story of 1,100 men who went to war armed not with heavy artillery, but with imagination, rubber tanks, sound effects, and paintbrushes. For 50 years, their incredible mission remained classified. Most of them took their secrets to the grave. But now, we can finally tell you what really happened. It all started in January 1944 at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The U.S. Army activated a new unit with an official name that told you nothing, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but they'd come to be known by a different name, the Ghost Army. Now, this wasn't your typical military outfit. The Army didn't want infantry grunts or tank commanders for this job. They needed something different, something unusual. They went recruiting at art schools across America. They wanted artists, designers, architects, actors, sound engineers, and radio operators. Men with high IQs and creative minds. Men who could think outside the box, when their lives depended on it. The mission was simple to state but audacious to execute. Fool Hitler's army into thinking American forces were somewhere they weren't, doing things they weren't doing, with equipment they didn't have. They would be a traveling roadshow of deception, moving from place to place across Europe, staging elaborate illusions right under the Germans' noses. Among those recruited was a young man named Jack McGlynn from Medford, Massachusetts. He joined the Sonic unit thinking he'd be doing something patriotic and high-tech. Being a young, naive gentleman, he later recalled with a smile, "I felt, well, I'm going to shoot the Germans with sound. That's for me. We're going to get this war over." But shooting Germans with sound was exactly what they planned to do, just not in the way young Jack imagined. Before they ever set foot in Europe, the Ghost Army spent months preparing. Jack McGlynn and his 7 teammates in the Sonic unit traveled to Fort Knox to create what would become their secret weapon, a massive library of battlefield sounds. They recorded everything: tanks backing up and stopping, trucks rumbling down highways, jeeps starting and idling, the clatter and bang of military convoys on the move. Every sound was carefully captured, then transferred onto records that could be played back at ear-splitting volumes. They modified 30 half-tracks, special armored vehicles, by mounting gigantic speakers on them. Each one could blast sound across miles of countryside. Imagine 30 military vehicles, each one a rolling concert speaker the size of a truck, playing the sounds of an entire armored division moving through the darkness. But sound was just one piece of the puzzle. The visual deception team was working on something even more remarkable. They had truckloads of inflatable equipment, rubber tanks that could be blown up like pool toys, fake artillery pieces, dummy airplanes, even inflatable trucks. Each one was carefully designed to look real from the air or through German reconnaissance binoculars. The radio operators, meanwhile, practiced creating phantom communication networks. They'd send fake orders, fake reports, fake chatter across the airwaves, all designed to convince German intelligence that entire divisions were operating in places where, in reality, there were only a handful of men with radio sets. The Ghost Army consisted of 4 main units working together. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion handled the visual deceptions. The 3132nd Signal Service Company Special handled the radio deceptions. The Sonic Company, Jack McGlynn's unit, created the sound effects. And the 406th Engineer Combat Company provided security and, ingeniously, used their bulldozers to create fake tank tracks in the mud. In June 1944, shortly after D-Day, the Ghost Army landed in France. The real war was on, and these artists and engineers were about to put their strange training to the ultimate test. Their mission required them to operate dangerously close to enemy lines. Often, they were just a few hundred yards from German positions. They had minimal protection, nothing heavier than .50 caliber machine guns. If the Germans discovered what they were really up to, if they realized they were facing not 30,000 men but barely 1,000, it would be a massacre. They parked their inflatable tanks in fields, positioning them where German reconnaissance planes could spot them, but making sure to camouflage them just imperfectly enough to be believable. Real tanks are never perfectly hidden. If the camouflage was too good, it would arouse suspicion. At night, when the dummy equipment couldn't be seen, that's when the sonic unit went to work. Jack McGlynn and his fellow sound engineers would drive their speaker-equipped half-tracks into position and blast their recordings across the landscape. The rumble of tank treads, the sound of hundreds of trucks, men shouting commands, the metallic clank of equipment. To German listeners in the darkness, it sounded exactly like a massive American force preparing for an attack. Meanwhile, the radio operators were busy creating an entire fake communications network, mimicking the radio traffic patterns of the unit they were impersonating. German intelligence units listening in would hear exactly what they expected to hear: a division preparing for operations, coordinating movements, receiving orders from command. But here's where it got really creative. The Ghost Army didn't just fool the Germans from a distance. They became actors in a very dangerous play. German intelligence relied heavily on reports from local civilians. Spies lurked in village cafes and brothels, gathering information. So the Ghost Army soldiers had to become the units they were impersonating. They wore the right patches, they painted the correct insignia on their vehicles, they positioned military police exactly where that particular division would position them. They even learned the distinctive ways different units wore their uniforms. Then they went into local villages with orders to talk loose. They'd sit in cafes, drink at bars, and deliberately let slip false information about upcoming operations. They'd complain about being reassigned. They'd grumble about where they were headed next. All of it carefully scripted lies, performed for an audience that included German spies taking mental notes. One can only imagine the tension. These men were artists and engineers, not trained intelligence operatives, yet here they were engaging in psychological warfare, knowing that one slip-up, one inconsistency, could blow the entire operation and cost lives. Between June 1944 and the war's end in May 1945, the Ghost Army conducted more than 20 major deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Not all of them worked perfectly. Some failed to fool the enemy, but many succeeded brilliantly, and in doing so, they saved countless lives. One of their most critical operations came during the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944. Hitler had launched a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. American forces were caught off guard and scrambling. The situation was desperate. In that chaos, the Ghost Army was sent in to create diversions, to make the Germans think American reinforcements were arriving in places where there were none, buying time for the real troops to regroup and counterattack. The weather was brutal. Soldiers suffered from frostbite. James "Tommy" Anderson, a truck mechanic in the 406th Engineer Combat Company, got frostbitten feet that would trouble him for years. But they kept working, inflating tanks in freezing temperatures, operating their equipment in the snow, maintaining the illusion even as real battles raged nearby. Tommy Anderson had another job too. He was one of the men who drove bulldozers to create fake tank tracks in the mud and snow. Imagine the scene. Darkness, enemy forces nearby, and men driving bulldozers back and forth, creating the tracks of phantom tanks that would never come. The Ghost Army's finest hour came in March 1945, at the Rhine River. The Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine, the last major natural barrier protecting Germany's heartland. It would be one of the most important and dangerous operations of the entire war. The success of the crossing could determine how quickly the war ended. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery all knew what was at stake. They also knew they needed deception to pull it off. The Ghost Army was given their most important assignment: simulate two entire infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, just south of where the actual crossing would take place. They had to make the Germans absolutely convinced that the main attack would come from that direction. For several days and nights, the Ghost Army performed the deception of their lives. Inflatable tanks, sound effects at maximum volume, radio chatter, fake command posts, soldiers in cafes spreading false information. Everything they'd learned, every trick they'd developed, was put into play. It worked. When the real 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions crossed the Rhine with Eisenhower, Churchill, and Montgomery watching, they met minimal resistance. The Germans were positioned elsewhere, expecting the attack from where the Ghost Army had convinced them it would come. The crossing was a tremendous success. The road to Berlin was open, and a group of artists playing soldier with rubber tanks had just pulled off one of the greatest deceptions in military history. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army had participated in 22 major battlefield deceptions. Military historians estimate they saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. They'd proven that creativity and imagination could be just as powerful as bombs and bullets. But there was no victory parade for the Ghost Army. No medal ceremony. No public recognition. Their mission was classified at the highest levels. They were ordered to remain silent about what they'd done. Tell no one. Not their families. Not their friends. The secret must be kept. And they kept it. For decades. John Joseph Williams came home and told his son and grandson some stories. He mentioned driving a truck through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. He said he'd been at Omaha Beach on D-Day. But he never told them about the rubber tanks, the sound trucks, or the elaborate deceptions. His son later said, "The fact that he was able to hold the ultimate secret that long was always astounding to me." These men went back to their lives. Many became successful in the careers they'd trained for before the war. They worked as artists, designers, architects. Some became quite famous in their fields, but they said nothing about their greatest accomplishment. There's another remarkable part of this story that makes the Ghost Army unique in military history. During their downtime between operations, many of these soldier artists did what came naturally to them. They painted and sketched. They documented their journey across Europe, not with cameras alone, but with watercolors, pencils, and ink. They captured scenes of destruction and beauty, portraits of fellow soldiers, landscapes of war-torn France and Germany, moments of quiet between the chaos. The result was hundreds of paintings and sketches, a unique artistic record of World War II, created by men who were literally using art as a weapon. One of those artists was John Jarvie. His niece, Beverly Gavin from Beverly, Massachusetts, inherited his wartime artwork after he passed away. For years, she had these beautiful paintings, but didn't fully understand the context of her uncle's service. The official record said he'd been in an engineering unit. That was all. Then, in 1996, everything changed. After more than 50 years, the US government finally declassified the Ghost Army's records. The secret was out. John Joseph Williams could finally tell his family the whole story. Jack McGlynn could explain what those sound trucks were really for. Albert Albrecht could tell his daughter Karen why he carried dynamite. For the veterans still living, it was an enormous relief. The burden of secrecy they'd carried for half a century could finally be lifted. They could share their incredible story with their families and the world. Filmmaker Rick Beyer heard about the Ghost Army and became fascinated. He spent years researching, tracking down veterans, collecting their artwork, and piecing together the full story. He interviewed 25 Ghost Army veterans for a documentary film. "I fell in love with these guys," Beyer said. "These guys are amazing." The documentary The Ghost Army premiered on PBS in 2013 to widespread acclaim. Suddenly, this forgotten chapter of World War II was being told to a new generation. But the recognition that mattered most came in 2024. After years of advocacy by families, historians like Rick Beyer, and veterans organizations, the United States Congress voted to award the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal. It's the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow, the equivalent of the military's Medal of Honor. On March 21, 2024, a ceremony was held at the US Capitol. By that time, only 5 Ghost Army veterans were still alive. 3 of them were able to attend. They stood there in their 90s and 100s, finally receiving recognition for what they'd accomplished 80 years earlier. Gilbert Seltzer, who passed away in 2024 at age 106, was one of the last survivors. His New York Times obituary finally told the world what he'd done during the war. John McGlynn, the man from Medford who thought he'd shoot Germans with sound, lived to see his unit honored. These elderly men, once young artists playing dangerous games of deception, were being celebrated as the heroes they'd always been. The families of deceased veterans received replica medals. For many of them, seeing their fathers and grandfathers finally recognized was an emotional experience. Randall Schrader's father, Colonel Edgar W. Schrader, had been part of the Ghost Army. Randall only learned about it a few months before his father passed away. He'd watched old home videos where his father vaguely mentioned the deception work, dismissing it as a bunch of malarkey. Walking through the Ghost Army exhibit that now travels to museums around the country, Randall was filled with mixed emotions: joy at understanding what his father had accomplished, sadness that his father had never felt able to speak openly about it during most of his life. Today, the Ghost Army story is preserved and celebrated through a traveling museum exhibit. You can see the actual inflatable tanks, looking remarkably realistic even now. You can view the artwork these soldier artists created between operations. You can read their personal stories and understand the incredible ingenuity and courage they displayed. The exhibit has been to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the Missouri Historical Society, Fort Wayne Museum of Art, and many other venues across America. For visitors, especially those who lived through World War II, or remember hearing stories from that era, it's a revelation. This part of the war was happening, and no one knew about it. The Ghost Army Legacy Project, founded by historian Rick Beyer and others including Rick Eichhorn, whose father served in the unit, works to ensure these men are never forgotten. They've placed a historical marker in Bettemberg, Luxembourg, at the site of one of the unit's missions. They're working on placing more markers across Europe. At Fort Leonard Wood, where Army engineers are trained today, the Ghost Army's story is taught as an example of innovation and problem-solving under pressure. As Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Williams noted, executing camouflage and deception operations are challenging tasks that have significant value and, when employed in operations, can truly determine the outcome. The men of the Ghost Army didn't have doctrine to follow. They were inventing it as they went along, problem-solving in real time with their lives on the line. That's a powerful lesson for any soldier, any engineer, any person facing impossible odds. What made the Ghost Army special wasn't just their cleverness or their artistic talent. It was their willingness to do something that must have felt absurd, even humiliating at times. They were soldiers who went to war without real weapons. They inflated rubber tanks while real tanks were fighting miles away. They played records of battle sounds while their comrades were dying in actual battles. It would have been easy to feel like they weren't really contributing, like they were playing pretend while others did the real work of war. But they understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting, but in doing the unconventional thing that nobody else can do. Sometimes imagination saves more lives than firepower. Think about what they accomplished. 1,000 men, armed with nothing more than inflatable decoys, sound recordings, and radio equipment, convinced Hitler's formidable military machine that entire American divisions were present where only ghosts existed. They drew enemy fire away from real troops. They confused German intelligence. They made the enemy commit resources to defend against attacks that were never coming, leaving weak spots in the line where real attacks would break through. And they did it over and over again, from Normandy to the Rhine, knowing that if they were discovered, if the deception failed, they had almost no ability to defend themselves. The story of the Ghost Army resonates today for several reasons. First, it's a reminder that wars aren't won by brute force alone. Intelligence, creativity, and deception have been part of warfare since ancient times. From the Trojan horse to the Ghost Army, the side that can make the enemy see what isn't there, or miss what is there, often wins. Second, it shows us that there are many ways to serve, many ways to be a hero. Not everyone has to be on the front lines with a rifle. Sometimes the quiet work, the secret work, the work that gets no recognition, is what makes victory possible. Third, it's about the burden of secrecy and the relief of finally being able to tell the truth. These men kept faith with their government's requirement for secrecy for 50 years. They honored their commitment, even when it meant their own families didn't fully understand or appreciate what they'd done. When the secret was finally revealed, when they could finally speak freely, it must have been like putting down a weight they'd carried for half a century. And finally, it's a story about memory and recognition. Most of the Ghost Army veterans have passed away. Of the 100 men who served, only a handful remained by 2024. But their story is being preserved, taught, and honored. The Congressional Gold Medal, the museum exhibits, the historical markers, the documentaries and books, all ensure that future generations will know what these unusual soldiers accomplished. As we remember World War II, as that generation passes into history, stories like the Ghost Armies become even more important. They remind us that history is full of incredible events we never learned about in school, that the men and women of that era were endlessly inventive and brave, in ways we're still discovering. The Ghost Army proved that art and war, creativity in combat, imagination and courage can combine in the service of a just cause. They took their talents, the things that made them who they were before the war, and found a way to use those gifts to save lives and help win the greatest conflict in human history. In the end, the Ghost Army wasn't really about deception at all. It was about truth. The truth that there are many kinds of strength. The truth that victory requires more than weapons. The truth that sometimes, the most powerful thing a soldier can carry into battle is an idea. And now, finally, after decades of silence, the truth of what they did, the full story of their remarkable service, has been told and honored as it should have been all along. The Ghost Army fought with imagination and won,